A biased and racist teacher. A classroom filled with tension. But there's a twist no one saw coming, and it's about to expose years of hidden prejudice. Prepare yourself for a story that will challenge everything you thought you knew about what goes on behind closed classroom doors. The bell rang, signaling the start of another day at Westfield High. Miss Roberts stood at the front of her English class, her stern gaze sweeping over the students as they settled into their seats. The air was thick with unease, an all-too-familiar tension that seemed to accompany every one of her lessons. As the last few stragglers hurried in, a new face appeared in the doorway. Jasmine King stepped into the room, her backpack slung over one shoulder. The eyes of her classmates followed her, some curious, others wary. Miss Roberts's lips tightened into a thin line as she watched Jasmine make her way to an empty desk. "Well, Miss Roberts said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "It seems we have a new addition to our class. I do hope you can keep up with our rigorous curriculum." The way she emphasized rigorous made it clear she had her doubts. Jasmine met her gaze steadily but remained silent. As Miss Roberts turned back to the board, the atmosphere in the room shifted, a storm brewing just beneath the surface. The tension in the classroom was palpable. What happens when a teacher's prejudice collides with a student's quiet strength? Jasmine's next move could change everything. Miss Roberts cleared her throat, narrowing her eyes as they settled on Jasmine. "Today, we'll be discussing the themes of power and oppression in To Kill a Mockingbird. Who would like to start?" Her gaze swept the room, deliberately avoiding Jasmine's raised hand. After calling on several other students, Miss Roberts finally acknowledged Jasmine with a tight, forced smile. "Yes, Miss King. Do you have something to contribute?" Jasmine straightened in her seat, her voice steady. "I believe the novel shows how systemic racism." "Systemic racism?" Miss Roberts interrupted, her tone dripping with condescension. "My dear, I think you're confusing this classic American novel with some modern political agenda." A ripple of unease passed through the classroom. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others smirked, eagerly anticipating the drama that was unfolding. Jasmine took a deep breath, her fingers curling around the edge of her desk. "With all due respect, Miss Roberts, the racial injustice in the book is a reflection of—" "That's quite enough," Miss Roberts cut her off again, waving a dismissive hand. "Perhaps you should focus on understanding the text as it's written, rather than trying to impose your own interpretations." The air in the room grew thicker with tension. Jasmine's jaw clenched, but her eyes never left Miss Roberts's face. She remained silent, her posture speaking volumes, a quiet defiance that seemed to unsettle the teacher even more. Miss Roberts turned back to the whiteboard, her marker squeaking as she wrote. "Now, let's discuss the actual themes the author intended. Can anyone tell me about the symbolism of the mockingbird?" As the lesson continued, Miss Roberts pointedly ignored Jasmine's attempts to participate. Every time Jasmine raised her hand, the teacher's gaze would slide past her, as if she were invisible. The message was clear: Jasmine's voice was not welcome in this classroom. Other students began to take notice. A few exchanged worried glances, their discomfort growing as the power struggle between student and teacher unfolded before them. Discomfort spread through the room with each passing minute. Some students, however, seemed to feed off the teacher's behavior, throwing sidelong smirks in Jasmine's direction. Jasmine's frustration was evident in the way her shoulders tensed and the tightness around her eyes, but she remained composed. Her pen moved steadily across her notebook as she took meticulous notes. It was a small act of resistance, a refusal to be silenced or pushed out of her education. As the class neared its end, Miss Roberts announced a group project. "I'll be assigning the groups," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "We wouldn't want anyone to feel out of place." The implications of her words hung heavy in the air, and Jasmine's eyes narrowed slightly, recognizing the challenge for what it was. She squared her shoulders, meeting Miss Roberts's gaze with quiet determination. When the bell rang, signaling the end of class, students began to file out. Jasmine took her time, gathering her things deliberately, unhurried. Just as she reached the door, Miss Roberts called out, "Miss King, a word." Jasmine turned, her expression carefully neutral. "Yes, Miss Roberts?" The teacher's smile was thin and sharp. "I hope you understand that in this class, we focus on facts and analysis, not personal opinions or agendas. I'd hate to see you struggle because you can't separate your feelings from the curriculum." For a moment, Jasmine said nothing. Then, with a calm that belied the storm brewing inside her, she replied, "I understand perfectly, Miss Roberts. I look forward to demonstrating my analysis skills in our next discussion." With that, she turned and walked out, leaving Miss Roberts staring after her, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. As the days passed, Miss Roberts's initial uncertainty solidified into cold resolve. She would show that girl exactly who was in charge, no matter the cost. The next class would reveal the depths of her prejudice and test Jasmine's strength like never before. The following week, Jasmine entered the classroom with her head held high, determined to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Miss Roberts stood at the front, her eyes narrowing as Jasmine took her seat. The air crackled with tension, a storm brewing just beneath the surface. As the lesson began, Miss Roberts's focus on Jasmine intensified. Every movement, every word became subject to scrutiny. "Miss King, is that gum I see you chewing?" she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Jasmine froze, her hand halfway to her mouth. She wasn't chewing gum at all. "No, Miss Roberts," Jasmine began, but the teacher cut her off. "Don't lie to me, young lady. Spit it out this instant." Miss Roberts's voice dripped with disdain. Jasmine's classmates shifted uncomfortably, some averting their eyes, while others watched with morbid fascination. Jasmine stood slowly, her movements deliberate. She walked to the trash can, pantomimed spitting out non-existent gum, and returned to her seat. The silence in the room was deafening. As the class progressed, Miss Roberts's behavior grew increasingly brazen. She nitpicked every aspect of Jasmine's participation, from her handwriting to her posture. "Sit up straight, Miss King. This isn't some casual hangout spot," she barked, completely ignoring the fact that Jasmine's posture was no different from that of her peers. Jasmine's frustration was evident in the tightness of her jaw and the way her fingers curled around her pen. She took deep breaths, struggling to maintain her composure as the onslaught continued. The classroom dynamics began to shift. Some students, like Sarah in the front row, shot sympathetic glances at Jasmine when Miss Roberts wasn't looking. Others, emboldened by the teacher's behavior, joined in with snickers and whispered comments. During a group discussion, Jasmine raised her hand to contribute. Miss Roberts's lips curved into a cold smile. "Yes, Miss King. Do enlighten us with your unique perspective." Jasmine's voice was steady as she began to speak, but Miss Roberts quickly cut her off again, her tone dismissive. The students' discomfort was palpable, and the tension in the room escalated. But through it all, Jasmine held her ground. The quiet strength in her resistance was becoming undeniable, and the battle between the teacher's prejudice and the student's courage was just beginning to unfold. Jasmine was interrupted almost immediately. "I'm sorry, but could you please enunciate more clearly? We can't all understand certain dialects." A collective gasp rippled through the classroom. Jasmine's eyes widened, her hands clenching into fists beneath her desk. The racism, once veiled behind subtle hints, now stood naked and ugly before them all. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Miss Roberts called out, "Miss King, please see me after class. We need to discuss your performance." Jasmine approached the teacher's desk, her heart pounding, but her expression remained carefully neutral. Miss Roberts looked up, her eyes cold. "I hope you understand, Miss King, that your attitude is becoming a problem. If you can't adapt to the standards of this class, perhaps you should consider finding a more suitable environment." The implication hung heavy in the air. Jasmine took a deep breath, her voice low but firm. "I understand perfectly, Miss Roberts. I'll continue to do my best, as I always have." As Jasmine turned to leave, Miss Roberts called out, "Oh, and Miss King, don't forget your group project presentation is due next week. I do hope you're prepared." Jasmine nodded, her mind already racing. She knew the presentation would be a turning point. Miss Roberts would seize the opportunity to humiliate her in front of the entire class, but Jasmine was determined not to give her that satisfaction. The air crackled with anticipation as Jasmine stepped up to deliver her presentation. Little did she know, Miss Roberts had been waiting for this moment to unleash her most brutal attack yet. What would happen when prejudice and power collided in front of the entire class? Jasmine took a deep breath, steadying herself as she faced her classmates. She had spent countless hours preparing for this moment, determined to prove herself despite Miss Roberts's constant belittling. The project board behind her displayed a meticulously researched analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird, focusing on the themes of racial injustice and moral courage. As Jasmine began her presentation, Miss Roberts's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a smirk. She watched like a predator waiting to pounce, her pen tapping impatiently against her grading sheet. The other students shifted uneasily in their seats, sensing the tension in the air. Halfway through her presentation, Jasmine paused to answer questions. Miss Roberts's hand shot up immediately. "Miss King," she drawled, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "I'm curious about your choice of focus. Don't you think you're overemphasizing certain aspects of the novel?" Jasmine's brow furrowed slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I believe the racial themes are central to understanding the book's message." Miss Roberts interrupted, her tone sharp. "I'm well aware of what the author said. But I'm more interested in why you seem able to appreciate the broader literary merits beyond your personal biases." A collective gasp rippled through the classroom. Jasmine's hands clenched at her sides, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "I don't believe my analysis is biased, Miss Roberts. I've supported each point with textual evidence and scholarly sources." Miss Roberts stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She strode to the front of the room, positioning herself between Jasmine and the rest of the class. "Let me make something clear, Miss King," she said, her voice rising with disdain. "This constant focus on race is not only misguided but also disruptive to the learning environment. Perhaps in your previous school such narrow interpretations were acceptable, but here we expect a higher level of academic rigor." The silence in the room was deafening. Some students stared at their desks, unable to meet Jasmine's eyes. Others watched with a mix of horror and morbid fascination as their teacher continued her tirade. Furthermore, Miss Roberts pressed on, her voice growing louder, "Your insistence on inserting modern political agendas into a classic novel only detracts from its true value. We are here to appreciate literature, not to make it a platform for personal politics." Jasmine stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest, but she refused to let Miss Roberts break her. The classroom had become a battleground, and she would not allow her dignity to be stripped away. Agendas into classic literature is not only inappropriate but also demonstrates a fundamental lack of understanding. "I'm beginning to wonder if you're truly capable of handling the curriculum at this level," Miss Roberts declared coldly. Jasmine's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she refused to back down. "Miss Roberts, I respectfully disagree. The themes of racial injustice in To Kill a Mockingbird are as relevant today as they were when the book was written. Ignoring them does a disservice to the author's intent." "Enough!" Miss Roberts snapped. "Your attitude is bordering on insubordination. I suggest you take your seat and reflect on whether you're truly prepared for the academic standards of this class." As Jasmine slowly gathered her materials, the weight of the humiliation pressed down on her shoulders. A small voice piped up from the back of the room, "But I thought Jasmine's presentation was really good." Miss Roberts whirled around, her eyes flashing with fury. "And what would you know about literary analysis, Mr. Peterson? Perhaps you'd like to join Miss King in detention to discuss your own academic shortcomings? The student shrank back in his seat, effectively silenced. Miss Roberts turned back to Jasmine, who stood frozen by her desk. Well, what are you waiting for? Sit down so we can move on to presentations that are actually worth our time. Jasmine sank into her chair, her face burning with a mix of anger and shame. She could feel the eyes of her classmates on her, some sympathetic, others cruelly amused. The injustice of it all threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to take slow, steady breaths as Miss Roberts called the next student to present. Jasmine's mind raced. She knew she couldn't let this continue, but what could she do? The teacher held all the power, and speaking out would only lead to more humiliation. For now, she would have to endure, but a quiet determination began to build within her. This wasn't over. As Jasmine sat in her seat, her mind racing with thoughts of justice and retribution, fate was about to deal an unexpected hand. The classroom door opened, and Miss Roberts looked up, a smug smile playing on her lips. "Class, I have an important announcement," Miss Roberts declared, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I've decided it's time for a parent-teacher conference regarding Miss King's performance." Jasmine's heart raced, a mix of dread and defiance coursing through her veins. She knew her father would stand up for her, but the thought of him confronting Miss Roberts filled her with anxiety. The other students exchanged glances, some worried, others curious about what would happen next. Miss Roberts continued, oblivious to the storm brewing just beyond her classroom walls. "I've requested a meeting with Miss King's parents after school today. I'm sure they'll be very interested to hear about her disruptive behavior and subpar academic performance." As the words left Miss Roberts's mouth, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. They were steady, purposeful, growing louder with each passing second. The entire class seemed to hold its breath, sensing that something momentous was about to unfold. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. There was a brief pause, pregnant with possibility, before a firm knock broke the silence. Miss Roberts's eyebrows furrowed slightly, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "Come in," she called out, her voice tinged with irritation. The door swung open, revealing a tall, distinguished-looking man in a crisp suit. His presence immediately commanded attention, and a ripple of recognition passed through the students. It was Mr. King, the school principal. Jasmine's eyes widened, a mix of surprise and relief washing over her face. She glanced at Miss Roberts, who was still blissfully unaware of the connection between the new arrival and her targeted student. Mr. King stepped into the room, his eyes quickly scanning the faces before him. They lingered for a moment on Jasmine, a flicker of recognition passing between them. The entire class seemed to hold its breath, sensing that the tables were about to turn. A concerned glance passed between them before Mr. King turned to Miss Roberts, his expression neutral, but his posture radiating authority. "Miss Roberts," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel, "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Miss Roberts straightened, plastering on her most professional smile. "Not at all, Mr. King. We were just wrapping up a lesson on To Kill a Mockingbird. Is there something I can help you with?" Mr. King nodded, his eyes now fixed firmly on the teacher. "Actually, there is. I understand you've requested a parent-teacher conference regarding one of your students." Miss Roberts's smile widened, clearly pleased that her authority was being recognized. "Yes, that's correct. I believe it's crucial to address certain issues before they become more problematic." "I see," Mr. King replied, his tone neutral. "And which student might this be, Miss Roberts?" Miss Roberts turned, gesturing toward Jasmine with a dismissive wave. "Miss King, actually. No relation to you, of course." Mr. King was Chinese American, so Miss Roberts assumed there was no way he could be related to her student. She chuckled at her own joke, oblivious to the growing tension in the room. Mr. King's eyebrow raised slightly, the only outward sign of his reaction. "Is that so? Well, Miss Roberts, I believe we should discuss this matter further, perhaps in private." Miss Roberts nodded eagerly, already imagining the support she would receive from the principal. "Of course, Mr. King. I'd be happy to share my concerns about Miss King's performance and attitude." As Miss Roberts began gathering her materials, Mr. King turned to address the class. "Students, please continue with your assigned reading. Will only be a moment." He then looked directly at Jasmine, a small reassuring smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It was a subtle gesture, but one that spoke volumes. Jasmine sat up straighter, feeling a surge of confidence she hadn't experienced in weeks. Miss Roberts, still oblivious to the true nature of the situation, led the way out of the classroom. Mr. King followed, pausing briefly at the door to cast one last glance at his daughter. The look they shared was one of standing and shared strength. As the door closed behind them, a buzz of excited whispers filled the room. Students leaned across desks, speculating about what was about to unfold. Jasmine remained silent, her eyes fixed on the door, knowing that beyond it, justice was finally about to be served. The closed door couldn't muffle the rising voices outside. Miss Roberts's confident tone gave way to stammering confusion as Mr. King's calm filled the air. How would the teacher's attitude shift when she discovered Jasmine's true identity? Miss Roberts led the way to an empty conference room, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. She turned to face Mr. King, a smug smile playing on her lips. "I appreciate you taking the time to discuss this matter, Mr. King. I've been quite concerned about Jasmine's performance and attitude in my class." Mr. King nodded, his expression still neutral. "I see. Please, tell me more about your concerns." Miss Roberts launched into her complaints, her voice growing more animated with each passing moment. "Well, for starters, she consistently challenges the curriculum. She insists on injecting her personal views into every discussion, derailing the lessons I've carefully prepared." As she spoke, Mr. King's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. He remained silent, allowing Miss Roberts to continue her tirade. "And her attitude," Miss Roberts exclaimed, throwing her hands up in exasperation. "She's constantly disrupting the class with her unique perspectives. Just today, she gave a presentation that completely missed the point of To Kill a Mockingbird, focusing solely on racial themes and ignoring the broader literary merits." Mr. King raised an eyebrow. "And you believe this focus on racial themes is inappropriate for discussing a novel that centers around a charged trial?" Miss Roberts faltered for a moment, caught off guard by the question. "Well," she began, but her voice trailed off, unprepared for the depth of his inquiry. "I believe we should focus on universal themes, not get bogged down in specific issues," Miss Roberts stated firmly. "I see," Mr. King replied, his tone measured. "And how exactly has Jasmine been disruptive? Can you give me specific examples?" Miss Roberts straightened, regaining her confidence. "Of course. She constantly raises her hand to challenge points I make in class. She argues with other students during discussions, and her body language, the way she sits there all defiant, it's clear she has no respect for authority." As Miss Roberts spoke, Mr. King's expression shifted subtly. A hint of steel entered his eyes, though his voice remained calm. "Miss Roberts, I'd like to ask you something. Have you considered that what you perceive as defiance might actually be a student engaged in critical thinking?" Miss Roberts blinked, taken aback by the question. Well, I suppose I hadn't thought of it that way. But Mr. King, you have to understand, this girl is simply not a good fit for our school. Her previous education must have been lacking. Perhaps a different environment would be more suitable for her." Mr. King's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I see. And what makes you think Jasmine's previous education was lacking?" "Well, it's obvious, isn't it?" Miss Roberts said, her voice dripping with condescension. "The way she speaks, her focus on certain issues, it's clear she hasn't been exposed to the level of rigor we expect here." Mr. King took a deep breath, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing beneath the surface. Miss Roberts, I think it's time I clarified something for you. Jasmine's previous education was excellent. In fact, I can personally vouch for it. Miss Roberts frowned, confusion evident on her face. I don't understand. How could you possibly know that? Mr. King's eyes locked onto Miss Roberts, his gaze unwavering. I know because I'm Jasmine's father. The color drained from Miss Roberts's face as the implications of Mr. King's words sank in. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. The smug confidence that had carried her through the conversation evaporated in an instant. You're... Miss Roberts stammered, her eyes wide with shock and growing horror. Mr. King nodded, his expression grave. Yes, Miss Roberts. Jasmine King is my daughter, and I've been listening very carefully to everything you said about her. Miss Roberts stumbled backward, her hand gripping the edge of a nearby desk for support. The realization of what she had done, of the prejudices she had revealed to the school's principal, and more importantly, to a father, crashed over her like a tidal wave. Mr. King, I had no idea, she managed to choke out, her voice barely above a whisper. Clearly, Mr. King replied, his tone carrying a weight that made Miss Roberts flinch. But ignorance is no excuse for the behavior you've displayed. Not only have you demonstrated a clear bias against my daughter, but your comments suggest a pattern of discrimination that goes beyond a single student. Miss Roberts's mind raced, desperately searching for a way to salvage the situation. Mr. King, please, I can explain. I never meant to. Mr. King held up a hand, silencing her. I think you've explained quite enough, Miss Roberts. We'll be having a much longer conversation about this. But for now, I suggest you return to your classroom. We wouldn't want to keep the students waiting, would we? As Miss Roberts numbly nodded and turned to leave, Mr. King added, Oh, and Miss Roberts, I'll be sitting in on your class for the remainder of the day. I'm very interested in observing your teaching methods firsthand. Mr. King's measured tone belied the storm brewing beneath the surface as he stepped back into the classroom, followed by a visibly shaken Miss Roberts. The atmosphere shifted palpably. Students straightened in their seats, sensing the tension crackling between the two adults. Class, Mr. King addressed the room, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. I believe we need to continue with our lesson for the day, but I also want you to understand something important. There are times when standing up for what's right is not just about learning from a textbook. It's about learning from the people around us, the way we treat each other, and the strength we find in standing up for what we believe in. The room fell silent as Mr. King's words hung in the air, the weight of the moment sinking in. Miss Roberts, still visibly shaken, stood silently at the front, her authority shattered in the wake of Mr. King's calm yet firm presence. King stood before the class, his expression serious as he prepared to have an important discussion about respect, diversity, and the true purpose of education. Miss Roberts stood rigidly by her desk, her earlier confidence evaporating. She glanced nervously at Mr. King, then at Jasmine, her mind racing to process the revelation she had just experienced. Mr. King continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. It has come to my attention that there have been some concerning incidents in this class, incidents that go against everything our school stands for. A collective intake of breath rippled through the students. Some cast furtive glances at Jasmine, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Miss Roberts, would you care to explain to the class why you felt it necessary to consistently undermine and belittle one of your students? The teacher's mouth opened and closed, words failing her. Mr. King, I never meant to. Never meant to what, Miss Roberts? Mr. King's voice rose slightly, his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. Never meant to make racist assumptions about a student's background? Never meant to dismiss valid interpretations of literature because they didn't align with your narrow worldview? The students watched in stunned silence as their usually mild-mannered principal transformed before their eyes. His words were precise and cutting, laying bare the injustices that had been simmering beneath the surface of their classroom for weeks. Let me be clear, Mr. King continued, his eyes locked on Miss Roberts. Your behavior toward Jasmine, and I suspect toward other students of color, is not only unprofessional, but deeply harmful. You've created an environment where students feel unsafe expressing their thoughts and experiences. Miss Roberts attempted to interject, her voice trembling. Mr. King, please, if I could just explain. Explain what exactly? Mr. King cut her off, his patience wearing thin. Explain how you mock Jasmine's analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird because it focused on racial themes. Explain how you've consistently ignored her raised hand in class discussions. Or perhaps you'd like to explain your comment about her previous education being lacking simply because she doesn't conform to your preconceived notions? The color drained from Miss Roberts's face as Mr. King recounted her actions. She glanced around the room, seeking any sign of support, but found only shocked and disappointed faces staring back at her. Mr. King turned to address the class once more. Students, I want you to understand something. Education is not about silencing voices or dismissing perspectives that challenge our own. It's about expanding our understanding, engaging in respectful dialogue, and learning from diverse experiences. He paused, letting his words sink in. What you've witnessed in this classroom is not education, it's discrimination, plain and simple. And it stops today. The tension in the room was palpable. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in agreement with Mr. King's words. Jasmine sat quietly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears of relief and vindication. Mr. King's gaze returned to Miss Roberts, who seemed to shrink under his scrutiny. Miss Roberts, your actions have demonstrated a clear pattern of discrimination that goes beyond a single student. This behavior is unacceptable and will be addressed through the proper channels. For now, he continued, I'll be taking over your class for the remainder of the day. As Miss Roberts gathered her things, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, the reality of the situation seemed to finally hit her. She cast one last desperate look around the classroom before hurrying out the door. The silence that followed her exit was deafening. Mr. King took a deep breath, visibly calming himself before addressing the class once more. I apologize that you've had to witness this, but I believe it's important for you to understand that prejudice and discrimination have no place in our school, or in our society. He moved to the front of the classroom, his posture strong, and began to speak once more, reinforcing the values of respect and inclusivity that every student deserved. Relaxing slightly, some students looked shell-shocked, while others appeared relieved. A few cast apologetic glances toward Jasmine, the weight of their silent complicity hanging heavy in the air. Mr. King cleared his throat, regaining the class's attention. I know this has been an intense and emotional experience for all of you, he began, his voice calm but resolute. We'll be bringing in a counselor to help process what's happened here. For now, class is dismissed early. Please use this time to reflect on what you've witnessed and how we can all work together to create a more inclusive environment. As the students filed out, many paused to offer words of support to Jasmine. Sarah, who had always sat quietly in the front row, approached hesitantly. I'm sorry I never spoke up, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I knew what was happening wasn't right, but I was scared. It won't happen again. Jasmine nodded, a small smile of understanding on her face. Thank you, Sarah. Speaking up is hard, but it's how we make things better. Outside the classroom, words spread quickly. Students gathered in small groups, discussing what they had heard in hushed tones. As Jasmine emerged, flanked by her father, a hush fell over the hallway. Then, slowly, a ripple of applause began. It started with just a few students, then grew louder until it echoed through the corridor. Jasmine walked tall, her head held high. The fear and isolation she had felt for weeks melted away, replaced by a sense of empowerment. Her classmates weren't just seeing her now, they were truly recognizing her strength and resilience. Meanwhile, in the administrative office, Miss Roberts faced the consequences of her actions. The school board convened for an emergency meeting, and within hours, a decision was reached. As the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Miss Roberts was escorted from the building by security, a cardboard box of personal items clutched to her chest. Students watched from windows and doorways as their former teacher walked to her car, her career in education effectively over. There was no satisfaction in the scene, only a somber recognition that actions have consequences. The next morning, as Jasmine approached the school, she noticed a change in the atmosphere. Students who had previously avoided her now offered friendly smiles and waves in the hallways. She overheard snippets of conversations about diversity workshops and plans for a cultural awareness club. As she entered her English classroom, now temporarily led by a substitute teacher, Jasmine was greeted by a sea of supportive faces. The tension that had permeated the room for weeks was gone, replaced by an air of openness and mutual respect. During lunch, Jasmine found herself surrounded by classmates eager to hear her thoughts on how to make the school more inclusive. Ideas flowed freely, from diversifying the curriculum to establishing mentorship programs for minority students. For the first time, Jasmine felt truly heard and valued. After school, as Jasmine walked out with her father, they passed by Miss Roberts's now empty parking spot. Mr. King squeezed his daughter's shoulder gently. "You know, Jasmine," he said thoughtfully, "what happened here isn't just about one teacher or one classroom. It's a reminder that change is possible, but it takes courage to speak up and stand firm in the face of injustice." Jasmine nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I just hope it makes a difference beyond today. There are so many others who face discrimination every day, in and out of school." The events at Westfield High exposed how prejudice can lurk even in educational settings. Miss Roberts's treatment of Jasmine revealed deep-seated biases that had gone unchecked for years. But Jasmine's courage in speaking up sparked a transformation. The school community rallied around creating a more inclusive environment, with new initiatives, diversity training, and open dialogues that challenged held assumptions. Students and teachers alike were forced to confront their own biases and blind spots. Jasmine's journey from victim to leader showed the power of resilience in the face of injustice. Her willingness to turn pain into positive change inspired others to examine their own beliefs and actions.